Hi there, thanks so much for joining us. We're delighted you've tuned in this evening. So this is one of our many online events this week as we reach the halfway stage of our virtual events weeks, exploring the theme of hope. Hope is always such a big issue for us, but with the coronavirus, it is a more pressing issue than ever. So where do we find our hope?
So some of our themes for tonight are going to be justice and freedom. I'm Lucy and Maddie will also be our hosts tonight. We're going to be having some panelists who will answer your questions. So if you have a question that you want to ask on justice and freedom in coronavirus, there is a link to Slido just in the description. So use it and post your questions and we will try our best to answer them. So one of our themes tonight is freedom. Freedom is seen as many as the baseline of our culture. We all love freedom and we all want to be free. And we want to be free to make our own decisions. And as a result, we often view any restriction or regulation forced upon us as very negative. And so tonight we're going to be looking at freedom. Firstly, Nay, I was wondering, could you answer our question? What have you found most restrictive about the lockdown?
Thanks so much, Lucy. So I'm married to John. We've got two little girls. I'm a 98% extrovert. I work from home normally. I think the thing I found most restrictive is not seeing my friends. I love seeing other mums on the school run. I love going swimming and running with people. And it's just felt so restrictive that up until a week or so ago, I couldn't do that with other people. Yeah.
Great. So again, we're going to be using Slido to answer your questions. So just go onto the link and ask them there. And after this is all over, we will be doing a follow-up conversation on Zoom if you have any other questions you would like to be asked.
Cool. So yeah, please also feel free to react to our video on Facebook. We'd love to hear from you and know that you're listening, able to hear us okay. And I want to introduce our three panelists quickly now as well. So and please do tell us a bit about yourself and also quickly what you've been up to during lockdown. So Andy, do you want to kick us off quickly?
Yeah, thanks for that, Matthew. So I'm Andy Bannister, and despite the English accent, I live in Dundee. That's been home for the last 3.5 years, and I head up an organisation called SOLAS, and we specialise in taking the Christian faith, the message of Jesus, out of the four walls of the churches and into places like pubs and restaurants and coffee shops and universities and all kinds of things. And yeah, lockdown's been interesting. Like Nay, I have small children, so this is an interesting household. And my biggest struggle, I think, during lockdown is as a hobby, I'm a mountaineer, and I was working my way through the Munros merrily on a time scale. I had it all planned out, and coronavirus landed. And so I've been looking at the distant hills, just frustrated that I can't get up them. So yeah, been sort of staying at home, lots of time with family and friends, and but can't wait till I can climb something bigger than 200 feet.
Gotta love a Munro, I know. Libby as well.
Hi there, guys. So I'm Libby. I have just recently finished a degree in radiography. So that's something that I've been doing during lockdown. Although after finishing it, I've been doing a bit of reading and painting. So I'm quite introverted, so I do quite enjoy the time myself. Although I'm looking forward to seeing friends as well now.
Class. And last but not least, Kerr.
Hi there, my name's Kerr. I, until last year, studied law at Glasgow's greatest university. I graduated last summer, and now I work for the civil service in Glasgow. So I'm stuck working from home, which is interesting. Productivity levels, I think, probably have dropped 80-90%, but they're climbing back up slowly as I get used to this. It's quite difficult not having a boss next to you and other people around you. I'm getting there.
Class. I must make a wee disclaimer there. Kerr studied at the Greatest Uni in Glasgow. That's Strathclyde, so that is highly debatable.
Definitely true.
So briefly mention freedom. Our other topic tonight is justice. So we've seen a growing sense of injustice building through this lockdown period. People can't visit their families. Many can't visit their loved ones in hospital. Local businesses are struggling for survival, and many are risking their lives in the front line. On top of all of this, especially in the last few days, many are really angry at the government's approach and are questioning whether they have the nation's best interests at heart. So a quick question about justice to kind of kick us off on the idea is Christianity just an escapism from the realities of how unfair life can be for people? So Andy, do you want to kick us off on that?
Well, what an absolutely brilliant question, Matthew, and thank you for whoever asked that. I want to say a couple of things there. Of course, the question, there's an assumption built into that question. And of course, the question whether Christianity is escapism really has built into it the question of whether Christianity is true. If Christianity is true, is false rather, if the message of Jesus isn't true, then I guess Christianity is escapism. On the other hand, if Christianity is true, then potentially it's atheism that's the escapism. And, one or two atheist philosophers have had the sort of courage to admit that, atheism at times, does potentially look like an escape from perhaps the implications that might follow if there's a God. If there's a God, there are some consequences that follow. There are some responsibilities that follow. There are some ways that we might want to respond that would follow. So, of course, the question really begs the assumption whether Christianity is or isn't true. What I would say, though, is this. I'm a great believer in really putting the two options on the table, and I may do this quite a bit this evening. If Christianity isn't true, the question is on something, that there is no escape. Because, okay, maybe we get through coronavirus this time, but then, in a couple of years' time, you're crossing the road, look the wrong way, and the number 43 bus gets you. Ultimately, life will get you. Ultimately, suffering is the final reality. And ultimately, of course, the human race will become extinct, the sun will expand and swallow the earth, and the whole universe will end in ultimate heat death. And it's interesting how many atheists have struggled with that over the years. That is the reality, and there is no escape. On the other hand, if the message of Jesus is true, then there is a hope, a genuinely concrete one, not just sort of talked about, but demonstrated and promised in what Jesus did, and especially demonstrated in his resurrection from the dead. And I think that's such an important contrast. I would say to whoever asked this question, take a serious look at the claims of Jesus, because if they stand up, there is hope, and if they don't, all we ultimately have is hopelessness. So much stands or falls on the identity of Jesus.
That's really helpful, Andy. Thank you. And briefly, Kerr, what would you say in response to that question of, is Christianity just escapism from the realities of how unfair life can be to people?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with everything Andy's just said. And it is just that idea of escapism is getting away from everything, isn't it? It's seeing problems, seeing trouble, seeing suffering, and thinking, right, how can I get away with this? And the way that we do it is to stick earphones in, to get Netflix on, to even just go for a run. That's a good thing, but we can use that for escapism, just to get away from everything. And Christianity doesn't do that. I'd say read the Bible. start somewhere, and you will instantly get into someone suffering somewhere. And Christianity doesn't pretend that away. It doesn't say that doesn't matter. It doesn't say that just close your eyes and imagine sunshine and daisies and it'll all be fine. No, it takes all that and it deals with it. It doesn't ask you to escape from that, but it says, actually, here's the reality of that, and it almost makes it worse. And we might come on to that later. It makes suffering, all these things, worse, but it does offer a way through that without just escaping it.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Cheers, Kerr. Well, Lucy, I'll move on with our next question now.
Yeah, and keep sending your questions in on Slido. It's great to be getting them. So already you've talked about hope and freedom, and Christians are always saying about how Christianity offers freedom in Christ. But I'm doing fine on my own. I don't think I need what's being offered in Christianity. What would you say to that response? Is it actually freedom if we have to follow the Bible and follow what God says in the Bible? Libby, do you want to start us off with that one?
Yeah, that's a good question, and one that I've often heard definitely that Christianity can seem very restrictive, but in the Bible, I believe that it's clearly laid out that actually true freedom is only found through Christ and through what we call the gospel. And this is because the world is what can be called fallen. So there's sin in the world, and that means that we are separated from God, and we're not able to have a relationship with God. And if you believe that the Bible is true, it says that we are created by God to be able to have that relationship, and we can come to have that relationship by Jesus having died on the cross for us, so that we might then be reconciled to God. And it's laid out that is true freedom. And personally, in a way, I, having been a Christian for a few years now, really belief that that is true, and I found that for myself.
Thank you. Great. Claire, what would you say if someone had that response that Christianity isn't actually freedom because there's laws and rules in the Bible? What would you say to answer?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I guess what is freedom to start with? So say you're an atheist and you think that's being free. I guess just think about all the limitations that are still put on you by society, by the government, by universities, by your friends, even by yourself. We so limit ourselves in terms of, oh well, I need to pass this standard because I need to get this and I need to do this, and actually we restrict ourselves almost because we give in to all these things around us. And Christianity actually frees us from all of that because it says there's no standard you need to reach. There's no way that you need to do things exactly right to get somewhere, to pass a test, to do anything like that. And it frees you just to live. And there are rules and all these things in the Bible, but none of them are bad. Because why on earth would God, who made the world, give us a rule or wisdom that makes life worse? Actually, everything in the Bible is the best way to live. And that's the best way to enjoy life, to enjoy the freedom that God's given us. And it's never as though the things in the Bible make life horrible and painful. Actually, the only reason things can seem horrible and painful is because of what Libby said, because of sin, the way that we reject and ignore God in the world that He's made. And actually, if we were to follow God's law perfectly, life would be perfect and we'd enjoy perfect freedom now.
Great, thank you.
So yeah, again, please do also, if you can't access Slido, comment on the Facebook Live your question there and we can access it there. And also the Slido link is in the description. So another question we have is quite pertinent at this time. Why doesn't God bring about justice now? Why is there this wait? Why can't He not right now bring justice when there's so much injustice in this world, as much as we can see that right now? How would you respond to that, Nay?
Yeah, thank you. What a great question, and such a big question as well, isn't it? Why doesn't God bring justice now? Well, I guess, again, what does that mean? What does it mean for justice? Does that mean justice for the policeman that killed a black man recently? Does it mean justice for me because I was angry with my children? Does it mean justice because of what's happening with the coronavirus and the impact? I guess the bigger question really I'd like to ask myself is, what does that really mean for me? If I'm asking God to bring justice now, what does it mean for me when I've also made mistakes? I've also offended people. I've also caused hurt and broken people. If I truly want God to bring justice now, I guess that's the end of me as well. And so I'd want to look back at what it means, what the Bible says about justice, how much Jesus cares about justice, what He did on the cross to take the penalty really of all the things in this world that are just so messed up, and to look at what the Bible says about what God promises in the future about justice. So I don't know if that's a good enough answer, but I think that's a problem when we start asking for justice because we also are turned in on ourselves as well.
Claire, you study some law at uni. You got anything to input on justice and that question as well?
Yes, I did study law at uni. Just to say, the only thing my law books now come in handy for is a stand for my laptop to get it right. I think exactly what Nate said. If we want justice to come, then what does that mean? What's our concept of justice? And it's interesting if you think about the courts and everything that goes on there, like criminal court's the easiest way to think about it. People commit crimes, go to court and get some kind of prison sentence, a fine and all that kind of thing. And we look at that and in our heart of hearts, do we really accept that that's justice? Someone does X, Y, or Z and gets X, Y, or Z from the court in return. But when we sit down and think about that, do we actually think that's fair? Do we think, the punishment that they're getting is enough. And for me, it's definitely not often the case. Often we can think of the most horrific crimes, and the punishments that we offer for them just don't seem good enough. And I think the only way to reconcile that is to look to God, the one who brings true justice in the end. And God doesn't shy away from any of that in the Bible. God talks clearly about what justice means, and about what will happen and has to happen for justice to be done. But as Nay said, the penalty for justice, you can either take it or you can allow God to take it for you, and it has to be dealt with somehow. And the only way that I think justice can be done for all the wrong I've done is for Jesus to take it on the cross, because I can't bear that judgment in myself. I know what that would mean for me, and I don't want that, and I can't handle it myself. Whereas I know that God can, and I know that He's taken it. And so I'm thankful that justice was done at the cross for me.
It's really helpful as well. And Andy, would you have anything to add to either of those comments?
No, well, I think there's really both helpful comments. My one minor thing I would add is that I think one of the reasons we get confused sometimes about justice is that we get justice mixed up with vengeance and revenge. And that often, if we're honest, when we say we want justice, we want someone to get their just desserts. I mean, you could argue the best way to see that illustrated is go and see any Hollywood action movie. You know, most in the standard Hollywood action movie, there's a good guy or girl and their team, and there'll be a bad guy. And of course, at the end, what do you want? You don't want the bad person to see the errors of their ways, pay the fine, and then have a lovely retirement playing golf. You want them to ideally die in some horrible way, and to know that that's coming. So many Hollywood movies are based on that, the great climactic end scene where the bad guy gets their just desserts. And the thing about that, the reason that resonates with audiences is our default position is we want revenge. And that's interesting because I think we all have a tendency to divide the world into good people and bad people. We put ourselves in the good category and we want the bad people to get their comeuppance. And as my two co-panelists have said, I think life is more complicated than that. That's not justice, that's revenge, and God has got something much bigger going on, because God wants to deal not just with what's gone on in the lives of those that we disapprove of. He also wants to deal with the stuff that we've done that we may be hiding from others or even hiding from ourselves. And I think one of the things that really attracts me to the Christian faith is it's the great leveler. It doesn't let me look down on others. You know, it's far too easy to say, you know, Dominic Cummings is a rotter. Look what he just did. You know, he should be lynched. And in the meantime, not knowing up to the things that I've done. And along comes God and goes, actually, I'm going to cast a spotlight on all of it. There will be justice. All wrongs will be righted. And the only question is, as I think Kerr alluded to, you know, will we stand before God and say, right, yeah, I'm going to pay. Thank you. I think I'm good. I'm big enough to do it myself. Or we stand before God and say, actually, I want to accept that offer made in Jesus to pay the penalty for what I've done with my own selfishness and mess ups and screw ups. That's the big question, I think, at the heart of all this.
Yeah, that's really thought-provoking stuff and questions to think upon. Yeah, thanks, guys.
Yeah, so going off what you're saying about justice and God bringing justice, well, in the Bible, there's so much that goes wrong. There's so many wars and just different things. So surely pushing a Christian agenda, would that not bring more injustice then? Nay, do you want to kick us off with that?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, thanks so much for the question. And so much has been done through history in the name of Christianity that's wrong and is contrary to the New Testament teachings or teachings of the Bible. So that's one thing to say. But also, I mean, I'd just like to give a current example of what's happening in COVID-19 and the number of churches that have set up amazing social enterprises in the last 8 weeks to love the vulnerable and care for the vulnerable. So in my city alone, all of the churches have got together and are sourcing our county council with food for families that can't afford food. We're also providing care for homeless people. And I know that that's replicated around the country. In fact, I'm trying to do a survey to find out how much that is replicated around the country. So on one way, yes, I agree with you, but on another way, from what I'm seeing now, in the name of Christianity, because God is a God that's focused on other people. He loves other people. He's a relational God. That is the thing that drives me as a Christian and drives others to love others, not to be self-centered. So I'd say anything done in the name of Christianity that's self-centered or abusive or like wrecks people, that's not Jesus' teaching. And that's not what I'm seeing now. Yes, it does happen. I admit that. But I'd question those people, really, what are they doing? Are they believers of Jesus? Would Jesus agree with what they were doing?
I think Lucy's Wi-Fi's frozen a bit there. So Libby, do you want to hop in on that one quickly?
Can you repeat the question again, please?
I think it's something like, is it, should we not be pushing a Christian agenda for justice? Will that lead to more injustice?
Yeah, and I think it said about what was in the Bible and the fact that there was like injustice seen in the Bible as well, isn't it? And I think that going off the back of that, an awful lot of the stories that are portrayed in the Bible are there to show us how God's people are sinful. Still, a lot of the Old Testament follows the Israelites, who were God's people, and it continually shows us how they were sinning against God and were not following His law, and it shows us that as humans, we aren't perfect, as we know, and there's no way that we could keep God's standard, and therefore we need Jesus having died for us.
So we've just keep please asking questions on Slido. So we've got an RV Slido question here. So Christianity says to follow the government that's in place. What should our response be if the government may err or make a mistake? What should our response be to that? Kerr, do you want to kick us off on that one?
So Christianity says we should obey the government. What happens if the government gets it wrong?
Yeah, errors was the word used, if that's helpful at all.
Errors or errors, sorry.
Errors, ERRS, sorry.
Well, I mean, firstly, governments have been getting things wrong for thousands of years, and I don't think that's a controversial statement. I think no one, I don't think, in government is sat there thinking, how can we do this wrong? How can we really muck this up? I don't believe that for a second. I think everyone who's working in government is trying their best with far more information than we've got going on in their heads, and far more to process. And the Bible is very clear. The Bible says that we, as Christians, indeed as citizens, should be subject to the governing authorities. We should obey them. We should respect them. In fact, as Christians, we should pray for them, that God would be with them, give them wisdom, and all these things. So if the government gets it wrong, then, well, firstly, it's not our decision to make, is it? We're just to obey them. And chances are, particularly with coronavirus, they haven't got it wrong in the sense of there's a right and a wrong answer. It is all very difficult, and I don't think we should be the ones to say, oh, well, one government said I can go out next Thursday, whereas one government said I can go out next Monday. So I'm just going to go out on Saturday because that doesn't matter. I think as Christians, we should respect the government and obey the government.
Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. Andy, would you have anything to add to that?
What a brilliant question, and the potential for causing gratuitous offence by picking on some political leader here is kind of wonderful. I think that was really helpful what Kerr said. I want to sort of dig into perhaps an issue behind this a little bit. That I think one of the interesting issues is that, you know, we live in this very kind of social media digital age where, you know, every move made by any government minister, whether he or she is on duty or off duty, is picked up, obsessed, you know, trawled over. You know, we have Twitter mobs and all kinds of other things. And one of my kind of concerns actually as a Christian is that actually, you know, we've talked about the wonderful public service done by our NHS workers and other key workers, and that's wonderful. But as Kerr pointed out, you know, to go, politicians, who would be a politician right now? who'd be a politician right now? That whichever decision you make is analysed, overanalyzed. You can't please all the people all the time, and the other half are out for your head. And one of my fears is we're not careful in recognising the service that most politicians, there's always bad apples, there are in every barrel, but that most women and men who go into politics go in because they want to make a difference. And if we make that such a horrible job to do because of the insults that will fall on your head, we run the risk that we don't get good people going into medicine, going into politics. I want good women, I want good men, I want the best, brightest minds to go, you know what, politics would be good. And so I think as a nation, we do need to think about whether we end up with the leaders we deserve, actually, if we're not very careful. And so certainly for Christians, I think we know, as Kerr said, we're encouraged to pray for our leaders. For those of us on this who are watching the stream who are not Christians, who are thinking about Christian faith or considering these things, maybe start thinking about how do we address perhaps that cynicism that our society tries to encourage in us, firstly towards all authority, and that sometimes is one of the reasons we struggle with the question of God. But of course, one of the problems with cynicism, if you're not careful, if you see through everything, then all you have is transparency. You have nothing solid. And I think there's a much deeper question going on there. So yeah, as a Christian, I want to encourage our leaders. I want to pray for our leaders. And I think I'd love to see a wider question in society. But how do we really encourage and support people and see politics to be as a vocation that people want to aspire to, because of the difference you can make? There's a much deeper societal sickness here, I think, that comes out at times.
Yeah, that's really good points, well, really helpful. Just a little bit of pushback on something Kerr was saying, and maybe a little bit what you were saying there as well, Andy. But what should we do when the government does things that are morally wrong? Like, it's just completely morally wrong. Yeah, Kerr, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, well, if the government does something completely morally wrong, so the government's put there by God. The Bible tells us that God's instituted the government. And there does come a point where the government institutes things which, as a Christian, I would say is morally wrong. It goes against God's law. It goes against what God has said the best way to live is. Now, what do I do then? Well, I'll probably pray. I'll pray first of all. I'll pray for the government. I'll pray for the individual politicians. I'll write to them. I'll explain why actually the way that the Bible says things is the best way. And I'll explain it not just because God says so, because that's probably not going to get you very far, but actually taking that, like I said earlier, God's way is the best way for everyone to live. It is true freedom. It's the best life. And I'll explain why the way that I view it is actually better for the whole of society. And then I would seek to obey whatever they do. And there does come a point where, you know, if the government says that Christians aren't allowed to meet, then I think that would be something which the Bible says that's an absolute red line. And actually, I must meet with other Christians. But until that point, to clarify, you can do that over Zoom and YouTube and all the rest of it. I have a secret church going on, but yeah, I think it has to go very, very far for me to get to a point of saying, right, I'm going to disobey, because that's not what the Bible ever commands. The Bible always says, submit.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And can I bring Nay on that quickly as well?
I mean, I just wish we were in person, because I'd like to just ask back, like, is this hypothetical? Is this an actual situation you're thinking of? Like, in my head, I'm like imagining the worst, like the government asking me to go and do something really bad. At that point, no, of course, I'm not going to go and kill somebody or do something that's against my values. So I think it's a bit of a hard question to answer. If you're there, just write back, what do you mean? Is this an actual like situation? Like who I am, my values, my morals are guided by who God is, what the Bible says about him, how he speaks to me. So I'm not going to go against any of those principles because of what the government does or doesn't say. But I'm thinking like, you know, stuff that's really outrageous here. So sorry, that's not a great answer, but it's difficult without specifics.
Yeah, no, I totally understand. Yeah, that's really helpful, guys. Thank you.
Yeah, so on our Facebook page, we've received a few comments about being a Christian in a time like this, where we have coronavirus, there's loads of stuff going on in the world. Firstly, I would really like to say thank you for those questions. We've had a lot of thinking on them and they're just really great to read. I hope that if you did leave that response, that you're here with us tonight, and we're going to try and answer your concerns, and we really hope that the panelists' answers will help clear your mind on these issues. So firstly, Nay, could I ask you, was the coronavirus, was it a planned event sent by God, or is it just coincidence?
Well, I think it's just really obvious that the world is just totally messed up, isn't it? Like everywhere you look, the physical world is messed up, society is messed up. On one day alone at the start of lockdown, my sister-in-law got thrown out of her house because she was a nurse. My brother lost his job. My stepdad got scanned. A close friend of mine has died in the last 8 weeks. This world is completely messed up and turned in on itself. So the Bible is pretty clear in many ways. There's this tower that fell on a man in the New Testament, and the people around him ask him, did it fall because he sinned? And the answer was no, it didn't fall on him because he was a sinful man. But it then says, all of you turn to God, find God in this time of need. And so I wouldn't want to say it's been sent by God. And it's certainly, like in that tower, it's not because anyone's worse than anyone else. I know good people that have died. I know bad people that have died. Like, it just doesn't work like that. But I do think the world's in a total mess, physical, spiritual, emotional. And we need to turn back to God as our maker and creator and sustainer at this time.
Thank you. Andy, what do you think, was coronavirus planned?
Well, I mean, similar to what Nay said, I think it's fascinating that question is actually addressed almost in a sense directly by Jesus. It was Jesus who addressed that example of the tower. But, you know, what I think is interesting, and is a brilliant question, is I do think there's something fascinating about the fact that as human beings, when suffering comes, whether it's something small and personal or it's something bigger like COVID-19, our natural inclination is to ask why. You know, we look for why answers to that. And I find that absolutely fascinating, because that kind of makes us unique among the animal kingdom. You know, rabbits don't sit there asking great existential, you know, questions about life. It's human beings who seem to be wired to be different. And certainly when it comes to COVID-19, there have been some unhelpful answers out there. I think that's a very unhelpful religious answer that someone's raised, that, you know, there are some Christians and other religious people going around going, it's the judgment of God or Allah or whoever. But of course, we forget there are also deeply unhelpful secular answers. The deeply unhelpful secular answer is, hey, isn't this great? This is evolution in all of its power. You know, along comes COVID-19 and look what it's doing. It's trimming out the weak and the elderly, the infirm. It's making the herd stronger. And that's a horrendous answer as well. So there are some pretty terrible answers sloshing around there, both on the secular side and on the religious side. But then, you know, the Jesus way, the third way that Nay touched on there, is interesting, right? Jesus rejects both those answers. He rejects the bad religious answer, and he has no time at all for the idea that the world is just a cosmic accident, but does remind us that all of us one day will face suffering. All of us one day will stand before our maker, and all of us one day will be called to account for the time that was given us. And so what I think COVID-19 definitely is a wake-up call, because let's be honest, we've lived very comfortable lives here, especially in the West. In much of the world, life is tough all the time. Here in the West, life is pretty easy most of the time, but coronavirus has come and swept all of those certainties away. And many of us are now facing questions and difficulties and uncertainties we haven't had to face before. And the question is, are we going to look those questions square in the face and be willing to explore them? Or are we going to stick our heads in the sand, turn on the Netflix, binge watch, and just, you know, distract ourselves until life goes back to normal? So my question for those of you watching this at home is, you know, what are some of the bigger questions that coronavirus raises? And what are you going to do about some of those questions?
Great, thank you.
So another question we had on Facebook this week is, what makes you say God is real and not just this idea that people kind of hold on to for comfort and hope, this kind of imaginary idea? What makes you say God is real and not just an idea that people hold on to for comfort? How would you respond to that, Libby?
Yeah, so this is a good question again. So first of all, what makes you say that God is real? So we have a historical account in the Bible of God and of his son Jesus, and this actually matches up to a lot of real historical evidence that we have as well in secular and just in society. And yeah, and I think I was watching on Monday night, and I think you can still go back and watch, and I'm sure Hamish gave a really good answer for how there are more historical accounts of Jesus than there are of Caesar at that time. So first of all, and then in general, you having a worldview, I think you can see, for me, it makes sense that God is real, and the idea that it's just for comfort, I would push against that, and the fact that actually the Bible talks very much about what we're talking about today, about injustice and suffering, and how those are very real today. And I think Kier talked a wee bit about how actually when you become a Christian, that can lead to more suffering. And in the world today, Christians are quite a minority. And actually, the life that we are, you could say, called to is harder and could be harder than if we were not Christians. So I think that, sorry, anyone else want to help out?
Andy, got anything to say on that?
Yeah, gosh, lots. What a question. What an absolutely brilliant question. Thank you, whoever answered it. Let me begin where Libby ended. I thought that, Libby, that was such a wonderful point, because often occurs to me that life would be a darn sight easier in some ways were I not a Christian, because I could do entirely as I want, with whom I wanted. I'd have no ultimate accountabilities. I would be able to make up my own morality and ideas of right and wrong. I could do entirely whatever I wanted with no accountability. And it's costly. And Jesus is very honest in this. In the third of the three historical biographies of Jesus of Nazareth in the New Testament, in Luke's Gospel, chapter 9, Jesus says, if anyone would follow me, if anyone would come after me, they have to take up their cross and follow me. He compared following him to being willing to die. That's not exactly good PR. I often think if Jesus had a social media handler back there, they'd have said, hang on, you just need to tone that down. That isn't going to tweet well. So Christianity is tough. If you're a Christian in China, it'd be much easier not to be a Christian, much easier to be a Maoist. If you are a Christian in Iran, the fastest growing church in the world is in Iran, much easier to be a Muslim than to be a Christian. It's costly in many parts of the world to be a Christian, so it isn't easy. But that leads to the question, is it true? And I think there's a massive amount of evidence we could talk about. That's a whole evening in of itself. Let me just say a couple of things briefly. If you really, whoever asked that, want to explore that evidence for yourself, you'll see to the sort of side, there we go, point that way, of my Zoom feed, you'll see the link to the SOLAS kind of website. That's the organization I work for. If you click through to there, you'll find under resources our short answer videos. And we've got about 72 different videos now. Each is about 4 to 5 minutes long. And lots of those explore the evidence for the Christian faith. There's evidence from philosophy, the fact that there is something rather than nothing. There's evidence from science, the fact that the universe and space and time had an absolute beginning and require an explanation outside of themselves. There's arguments from justice, the fact that actually it does seem to be the case that right and wrong transcend human beings. They're not just human inventions. If I hypnotize you all to think it's okay to torture babies, it doesn't matter that you all think that, it's still wrong. There's arguments from the way that we're wired as human beings. We seem to be wired to look for meaning and purpose. And as Libby so beautifully laid out, there's the evidence from Jesus himself, because when you talk about God and does God exist, I always want to turn the question around to you and say, what God are we talking about? Because the God of the Bible is not some sort of theoretical sort of God who's out there, some sort of life force, like the force in Star Wars, or some kind of principle. But the God of the Bible is a God who's relational, a God who's personal, a God who can be known, a God who is love, and has demonstrated that by stepping into history in the person of Jesus. And so the God of the Bible is, in a sense, got his nose up against the glass, tapping on the window, saying, hey, we need to have a conversation. And so I put those pieces together, and that gives you a wonderful, multi-stranded argument for the existence of God, but culminating in him stepping into history in the person of Jesus, as Libby reminded us.
I think as well, I'd love just to add to that. is he real? For me, it's, is he real now in the midst of COVID-19? Has he shown himself to be real in my life? And, you know, it's been hard for all of us, hasn't it? I don't know how coronavirus lockdown's been for you, but the thing that has kept me is who Jesus is and what he did when he died and he rose again, what that meant for the future of our world. And I just want to read this because I think it's really helpful. It says, the message of the empty tomb is this: this is not the way it should be, this is not the way it will be, because God is love and love will win. So is he real? Does he make a difference in my life? Yes, 100%. Because what he says about the mess up of our world right now is that this is not the way it will be or should be, but love will win because love is God. God is love. So yeah, I hope it's helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, guys. That's really helpful.
Thank you. We just have time for maybe one or two more questions. So going back to the point on justice that you made earlier, Claire, Nietzsche has a good point when he says that offering hope is just giving people false security. So religion is a poison and we're better off without it. What would you have to say on that, Claire?
Religion is a poison and we're just better off without it.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, that in so many ways that's true. If all religions are false, isn't it? That we're just following something along and wasting our time and wasting our energy and all of our lives. We're just doing that, and it's poisoning other bits of our lives by controlling us and restricting us. I heard a wonderful image. Imagine you're in the biggest lecture hall on your campus. So Strathclyde, think John Anderson, 325, that kind of thing. And a fire starts and the smoke comes down and the fire alarm's going and there's no sprinklers and there's no lights, there's no nothing, and you're all on the ground and you're trying to find your way out. And someone's over there and they found the fire exit and they open it. What are they going to do? They're going to shout, "Here's the way out." And that's not poison, because, well, they found salvation, haven't they? They found the way out of that room, and they found the way out of danger and what would become death. And if Christianity is true, which we on the panel believe it is, then no, it's absolutely not a poison. It's salvation, and you could well say that any belief system then is poison, and atheism, that's a belief system, and that would be poison. But no, if a religion's true, then it cannot be a poison.
Perfect, thank you. Livy, do you have any other points to make?
Can you repeat the question again, please?
So Nietzsche said that offering hope is just giving people false security. Religion is a poison. What would you say to that?
Yeah. So, yeah, offering hope is just false security. Well, I think hope is, can mean different things for us all. And I think that true hope is found in the gospel. And I think, that is evidence in our lives, and the fact that, as Claire said, that we want to share this with you. And I think I'll pass over to Andy, because I think you'll have.
Thank you, whoever you are, for that question. Not least, I'm really glad that you threw into the question one of my favorite philosophers, Nietzsche, because I think Nietzsche's interesting. Very famous atheist philosopher, but brutally consistent. And a lot of atheists I meet are inconsistent and try to throw God out the window, but hold on to all the things that come with Christianity. In fact, it was Nietzsche who famously said, when you give up the Christian faith, you pull the right to Christian morality out from under your feet. Morality is by no means self-evident. And when you break one part of it, the faith in God, you break the whole thing. And so he talked about what the whole of morality has to go: belief in justice, belief in human value and dignity. If you read Nietzsche consistently, he believed that there was no such thing as good or evil. There was just the will to power. And if you have power, you can use it any way you like to abuse the weak. And so Nietzsche, I think, really tried to explore what a universe without God looked like. And so to whoever asked that question, I would almost turn that around to you and say, have you genuinely tried to live that way? Have you gone, okay, I don't believe there's a God, I believe any talk of hope is just an illusion. Any talk of justice and meaning and significance are just illusions. I am literally going to live like I'm nothing more than, to quote another famous atheist, Bertrand Russell, I'm just a random collocation of atoms, and everyone I care about is the same. I challenge you to say, I bet if I spent 5 minutes with you, I could find an inconsistency. And even Nietzsche was inconsistent, because Nietzsche famously also said, and I think this quote is deeply applicable to the time we are in now. He said, he who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. What he's saying, when the life is tough and suffering comes, if you have found that why to live for, if you have found that bigger story, then you can survive almost anything that life throws at you. And if you can't, you're probably going to go mad. And Nietzsche arguably went mad at the end. So I guess I would really challenge you who has asked that question. Have you really tried to live that philosophy out? And if you can't, isn't it interesting? Because I don't think you can live in God's world that way. We are wired to discover hope and meaning and purpose and justice, which means only one of two things holds. Either evolution has played a tremendous trick on you, wiring human beings to look for these things and need them, or we're built that way because we were designed to find those things, and the God who loves us and designed us for a relationship with him. And the very fact that we ask questions like why when coronavirus comes along, the fact that we can't live without hope, to me is a massive, great big sign pointing somewhere. And the amazing message of Jesus is actually Nietzsche was wrong. There is hope, there is purpose, there is relationship with God, and it's the best thing of all. It's free, and all you have to do is turn around and stop running, and God is there ready to welcome you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Andy. I've been informed that you can all see our Zoom chat, so I do apologise for that. That wasn't meant to happen. We just use that to try and make this event run more smoothly for you guys, but I do apologise for that. That shouldn't have happened, so it's a good laugh. Final question before we move on to sum up about it. So how can we say God is just if justice is a non-universal idea, i.e. each person can interpret it in a different way? So quite a deep one there. Does anyone want to jump in on that? I'll say it again. How can we say God is just if justice is a non-universal idea, as in each person can interpret justice in a different way?
I might. Yes, great question. I'm just going to start an answer, and someone else can chip in. I would say that justice is not a. What was the description? Non-universal. Yeah, so
Yeah.
non-universal meaning it's not the same everywhere to everyone at all times. I would say that it is, and the only reason that we think it's not is because of what we've talked about before, because of sin, because of the way that we want to reject and ignore God in the world. And so we've kind of made a justice system. We've got our justice system in Scotland, and there's a different one in England, there's a different one in France, and there's a different one in America, and we all do things slightly differently because we've all got ideas about what justice is. But that's changed so much. That's changed so much in the last 10 years, never mind the last 100 years, never mind the past 1,000 years. And that's because the way that we as a society have got together and thought about good and evil and wrong and right has changed. But actually that's not consistent, is it? If something was just 100 years ago, then it should be just and right now. So I think justice is universal, and actually the only one who's able to apply it universally, consistently, rightly, is God, and not us.
Who else wants to jump in on that?
Happy to, if no one else wants to. Just to, I mean, Kerr, that was really, really, really helpful. Yeah, a couple of things very quickly. I think that the line behind the question we need to ask is justice something inside us or outside of us? Because if it's something outside of us, yeah, we may have different understandings or interpretations of it, but you know what, it's external, we can go and check. And I said, that I'm a mountaineer. I love climbing, particularly the Munros. And perhaps it turns out that Matthew is as well, and we have a bit of an argument about what the summit of Schiehallion, a mountain not too far from here, is like. And I think I remember it one way, and he remembers it another. We've got different interpretations, and finally Libby goes, "I'll blow it. I can't bear you two guys arguing. As soon as lockdown's over, I'm going to hike the darn mountain and take a photograph and check." And of course she can, because Schiehallion, the summit, is external to us. And yeah, we can have disagreements, but we can go and check. And I think ethics is like that. I think justice is like that. Yeah, we may argue and disagree about it, but there is something out there to be discovered. And I think the Bible is very clear in that. And flowing out of that, I think the foundation of all ethics, and we can interpret it in different ways in jurisdictions, the fundamental building block of all ethics and all justice is the question of what is a human being. You know, if we are just atoms and particles and molecules in motion, then it's really hard to build justice on that, very hard to build human rights on that. You know, if I configure a set of atoms one way, I have a table. I configure it another way, I have a human being, and suddenly it magically gets rights. I mean, what happens? The human rights fairy appears and grants rights and dignity. Where does that fundamental building block of justice come from? The Bible is very clear. In the very first book of the Bible, we're told that God created human beings, male and female, in his image. We're not just bits of dirt and dust, but actually God breathed into us and we're image bearers. And then the other verse that tells me where justice is founded, one of my favorite verses in the whole of the Bible, in Romans 5, verse 8 in the New Testament, we're told God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And the Bible says God paid an infinitely high price for each one of us when his son Jesus Christ died for us. And of course, economic theory says that value is determined by what someone is prepared to pay. And God is prepared to pay a tremendously high price for each one of us. Whether you believe in him or whether you're running away and rejecting him, it doesn't change the fact that your value comes from how God made you and how God died for you.
That's really helpful. And I hope whoever asked that question, that was the answer you were looking for, and that's been helpful. So Ellie's going to have our question for us now.
Yeah, so one really popular question we have had throughout this, we'll just finish on this question as well. How can the church care about justice for all people whilst sometimes actively oppressing women and the LGBTQ people? Andy, do you want to start us off with that?
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. The nice, easy question at the end. And well, thank you for whoever asked that question. And again, I think several of us have said this as the night has gone on, that you're very conscious that doing this over Zoom and live stream is like super weird, because this is the kind of question where if you'd ask this live, I'd love to see who I'm addressing, and also with something as big and as potentially personal and sensitive, I'd love to have said, look, if my answer hasn't connected with where you're coming from, come and talk to me afterwards. Let's grab a coffee. I'd love to say more. So the first thing I just want to throw into the live stream, weak as it is over digital, but please hear the force of my words behind here, is that, look, if anyone has said anything to you personally that has hurt you, and done that as a representative of the church, I'm sorry. I have met people who have been deeply wounded, sometimes by Christians, I'm afraid, being deliberately unhelpful, sometimes just by Christians being crass, because Christians are not perfect. We are being reconstructed through the work of Christ in us, but some of us have a lot more work in progress to go. So if you've been hurt personally or someone you care about has, I can only say that I'm sorry. The sad thing here is that there's a perception sometimes in the way that the church has talked about sexual ethics, that you have to, in some way, perhaps if you come from one of those communities, I'm not so much addressing the women issue right now, but addressing the LGBT one, that somehow, God doesn't like you, that God hates you, that you're not good enough for God, that you've got to change your way of living before God will even take a look at you. And why that so saddens me is that's a total travesty of the gospel. Because Jesus in the gospel was offered this radical welcome to everybody. He turned nobody away. He ate and dined and hung out with those that were the outcasts in society. He was regularly getting himself into trouble with the religious leadership because they thought he was hanging out with all the wrong people, and he turned nobody away. Now, when people came to him, he did make very clear that there may need to be some changes. And that's the experience for all of us who on this panel who have followed Christ, that all of us were living lives in different states of separation from God, and all of us are welcomed as we are. And then began that conversation with Jesus saying, okay, now we need to begin putting some things back together. And certainly when it comes to sexuality, the Bible is very clear that God has a design for sexuality. And that could be tough for some of us to hear. But hear what I'm saying. God does not say to our friends in the LGBT community, you need to live this way morally and then I'll accept you. Because human beings can't live up to God's standards. None of us can. And I am been deeply moved over the years by having many, many friends who have come to Christ from LGBT backgrounds. And to recommend just one book to you, whoever asked this question, that you may find helpful. I have a book written by a dear friend of mine called David Bennett called War of Loves. And you can find that on Amazon. And David was an Australian atheist gay rights activist, not merely in the LGBT community, but a frontline activist and very, very active in the community, absolutely committed atheist, and had this dramatic encounter with God in a coffee shop in Sydney some years ago that turned his entire life around. And that started a very long and winding journey. It was not an easy story, and I don't want to sort of spoil you with where the book goes. Take a look, because what comes out of that book is the tremendous love that God has for everyone, no matter what background they come from, but also that following Jesus is always costly. It's costly for all of us. But the church should never turn anybody away. Jesus never turned anybody away. And if you've been hurt by Christians or the church, all I can say is I'm sorry, but please try and take a fresh look at Jesus and the radical welcome that I believe that you'll find there, and the power to address perhaps some of the things that you're wrestling with.
Yeah, thanks for that, Andy. And thanks for that question as well. It's such an important issue, and we'd love to chat more about it. So I'm going to start summing up now, and we're going to ask the panelists a quick question, just a sentence about how Jesus answers these issues. But before that, I just want to remind you that you can continue this conversation on Zoom with some of our panelists. There is a link in the description for this post. We'd love to continue the conversation with you there. We've got loads of questions on Slido that we've not been able to get through. We'd love to have got through them, but as I say, time is against us. So please do continue that conversation on Zoom in the description again. It's in the link for the post. So yeah, so just a couple of sentences each, guys, to sum up. How does Jesus answer and give answers to the questions of freedom and justice? How do they relate to Jesus? What would you say on that? A sentence or two each. Nate, do you want to kick us off on that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for that question. So going back on what somebody said earlier, Jesus to me isn't poison, but he is peace. And I've seen that most clearly in a friend that came to know Jesus 3 days before she died. 3 days before she died of terminal cancer, leaving 5 kids behind. She said to me, "Nay, I have peace in my death because I know that Jesus died and rose again for me, and I believe in resurrected bodies." So I think the message of Jesus is peace, not poison.
Kerr, do you want to hop in now?
Yes, so much to discuss and so much could be said. I think Jesus and the Bible and the Christian worldview make sense. And I would challenge you, we've got more time now than we're ever going to have in the rest of our life. Use it. Decide, okay, actually, you know, I've bothered listening to 5 minutes of questions or an hour of questions about it. How about I read what Jesus says? I challenge you to sit down and to do that and to see if it makes sense. Because Christianity makes sense of the world, it makes sense of the suffering in the world, it makes sense of all the problems. And it offers freedom, true freedom to live the life that Jesus and God made us to live. And ultimately, it does point towards justice, which is what we want, everything to be made right again.
That's great, Kerr. Thanks, Libby.
Yeah, just echoing the same sort of things that as a panel, each of us truly believes that in Jesus we can find true justice and true peace and hope as well. And I think that there can be so many variations, as we've seen, of justice and peace and hope. And so how do you truly know what that word means? And I think that there is a solid definition and answer in the Bible that can satisfy all all longings, really. So really, please check it out.
Brilliant, thanks. And last but not least, Andy.
Yeah, I think what interests me, freedom and justice are both concepts that you can think about intellectually in very profound ways. And they're also things that affect our everyday lived reality. And as somebody who's kind of split, left brain, right brain, I think what attracts me so much and has kept me following Jesus over the years is that you can explore the Christian faith to the deepest intellectual level. And I've done that through academic study, and there are great answers and evidence. You can also try exploring living out and seeing the difference that it makes. And as someone who's followed Jesus for 25 years, through some pretty dark times of loss and pain and bereavement and depression, he has never once let me down existentially and in my everyday lived existence. And it's that fact that Jesus answers the questions of the heart as well as the questions of the head that I think makes him totally, utterly unique, worth investigating more than that. worth following.
Perfect, thank you so much. That is us going to be done for tonight on the Facebook Live. But as Maddie said, we will be continuing this conversation on Zoom chat. So if you go to the description in the link, you'll be able to click on the link and come on to Zoom with us. Some of the panelists will be here, me and Maddie will be here, and you'll be able to continue asking those questions. Very sorry if we didn't get your question answered. A lot of questions have been asked tonight about suffering. So tomorrow night we actually have an event on suffering with the question, why would God allow COVID-19? So that will be more directly addressed there. Friday's event is there hope for the future? It'll also be a really great one. Tomorrow John Lennox is speaking, he's a professor, very wise, so I really recommend going to that. Yeah, so also the book that Andy mentioned, it will also be linked in the chat in Facebook. So if you were interested by that, you can click on that chat and get the book there so you could read it. So thank you to the audience. It's very weird not being able to see the audience in front of me, but thank you so much for listening in. We've really loved having your questions and just being able to have this panel. Panelists, thank you so much as well for taking the time out to answer these questions and just being here with us. It was really good, and just thank you for your answers and your wisdom. Yeah, I think that is us.